unraveled CEO's life changed forever after finding two girls staring at chocolate. The truth destroyed him. What if I told you that the most ruthless CEO on Wall Street was about to have his entire world destroyed by two 5-year-old girls staring at chocolate through a window? Would you believe that a man who fired employees before breakfast was about to discover something that would change him forever? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Alexander Blackstone didn't earn his reputation by accident. At 34, he commanded a tech empire worth billions, and his employees whispered that ice water flowed through his veins instead of blood. This was a man who dismantled family businesses over lunch meetings and slept soundly afterward. The autumn rain hammered Manhattan's streets as Alexander's black Bentley crawled through evening traffic. He was heading to another charity gala, not because he cared about helping anyone, but because his public image demanded it. These events were just business transactions dressed up as compassion, but traffic had other plans. The Bentley stopped at a red light in one of the city's forgotten neighborhoods, where luxury cars rarely ventured. Alexander glanced out dismissively until something froze his blood cold. Across the street, pressed against a small corner store window, stood two tiny figures that would haunt him forever. Two little girls no older than 5 stood motionless in the drizzling rain. Their long brown hair clung to thin shoulders, and their matching pink dresses were faded, torn, and completely inadequate for the October chill. But their appearance wasn't what stopped Alexander's heart. It was their eyes. Both children stared through that glass with an intensity that cut through the darkness like laser beams. Their small hands were pressed flat against the window, their faces illuminated by the warm glow from inside. They weren't moving, weren't speaking, just staring with a focus that seemed impossibly mature for children their age. Alexander followed their gaze to see what held them captive. A simple display of chocolate bars arranged near the window. Nothing expensive, nothing exotic, just ordinary milk chocolate. But these children looked at those bars like they were staring at the crown jewels of England. Just street kids looking for candy, Alexander muttered, forcing himself to look away. But something magnetic pulled his eyes back to them. The girls remained perfectly still, their breath creating small clouds of fog on the glass. The taller one wrapped her thin arms around her sister's shoulders in a gesture so protective, so heartbreakingly mature, that something uncomfortable stirred in Alexander's chest. The light turned green. His driver pulled forward, and in the side mirror, Alexander watched those two small figures disappear into the distance. But their image burned itself into his memory like a brand he couldn't shake. Have you ever seen something that completely shattered your understanding of the world? Something that made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself? Because that's exactly what was about to happen to the coldest man in corporate America. And those two little girls were just getting started. The charity gala was exactly what Alexander expected. Manhattan's elite writing checks to buy themselves clean consciences while discussing their latest acquisitions over champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. These people didn't care about helping anyone. They cared about being seen caring. Alexander moved through the crowd with practiced precision, shaking hands and delivering perfectly calculated small talk. But tonight something felt different. Those two faces kept flashing through his mind, disrupting his usual cold focus. Alexander. Dr. Margaret Hayes, director of the Children's Foundation, approached with her characteristic warm smile. She was one of the few people who dared speak to him as an equal, rather than kissing his ring like everyone else. Margaret, he nodded curtly, I trust your numbers are meeting expectations? Always straight to business, she laughed, but her expression quickly turned serious. Actually, I need to discuss something alarming with you. We're seeing a massive increase in homeless children throughout the city. Many are living completely alone on the streets, with no family, no support system whatsoever. Alexander's mind immediately flashed back to those two girls at the store window. How many are we talking about? The statistics are absolutely heartbreaking. Last month alone, we encountered over 200 children living without any proper care. Some are orphans, others have been abandoned, or separated from families due to circumstances beyond their control. 200 children, living alone. The number hit Alexander like a physical blow, but he maintained his emotionless mask. These aren't just statistics, Alexander. These are real children sleeping in alleys, digging through garbage for food, completely vulnerable to every danger you can imagine. The conversation was interrupted by other donors demanding Margaret's attention, but her words echoed in Alexander's mind throughout the evening. As the gala finally ended and he prepared to return to his penthouse, those two faces returned with crushing clarity. Instead of heading home, Alexander found himself giving his driver very different instructions. "Take me back to that intersection where we stopped earlier." It was nearly midnight when they arrived. The area was mostly deserted, the corner store closed and dark. Alexander was about to dismiss this as foolishness when he spotted movement in the narrow alley beside the building. There they were. The two girls sat huddled together against the brick wall, sharing a single thin blanket that looked like it had been salvaged from a dumpster. They were awake, their eyes alert and watchful like small animals ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Alexander stepped out of his car, his expensive shoes clicking against the wet pavement. The sound made both girls tense immediately, the older one positioning herself protectively in front of her sister. This was the moment that would define everything. The richest man in the city standing face to face with its most vulnerable residents. Up close, he could see they were even younger than he'd thought, their cheeks hollow with hunger, their lips blue from the cold. What do you think happened next? Did the man who'd built an empire on ruthless decisions walk away from two starving children? Or was he about to make the choice that would destroy everything he thought he knew about himself? The answer would shock everyone who knew Alexander Blackstone, including Alexander himself. "Don't be afraid," Alexander said, his voice softer than he'd intended. But the older girl's response cut through him like a blade. "We didn't do anything wrong, mister," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with fierce defiance. "We're not bothering anyone." Alexander knelt down to their level, ignoring the damage to his $1,000 suit. "What are your names?" The girls exchanged glances before the older one answered. "I'm Luna, and this is my sister Stella." "Where are your parents, Luna?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Luna's small jaw clenched, and she pulled Stella closer to her body. "We don't have parents. We take care of each other." "How long have you been living on the streets?" 3 months, Stella whispered, speaking for the first time. Her voice was so quiet Alexander had to strain to hear her. 3 months. These babies had been surviving alone for 3 months in one of the most dangerous cities in the world. "Tell me what happened," Alexander said gently, but Luna's walls went up immediately. "Why do you want to know? Are you going to call the people who take kids away?" The fear in her voice was absolutely heartbreaking. At 5 years old, this child had already learned that adults couldn't be trusted, that safety was an illusion, and that she was the only thing standing between her sister and complete destruction. But slowly, piece by piece, their story emerged. Their mother, Isabella, had been a single parent working 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. When she died suddenly from an undiagnosed heart condition, the girls had no other family to turn to. The state system was overwhelmed, understaffed, and completely unprepared for 2 traumatized children, who didn't understand why their world had collapsed overnight. Before proper arrangements could be made, Luna made a decision that would save both their lives and nearly destroy them in the process. She grabbed Stella's hand, and they ran. For 3 months, these children had been living by their wits. They slept in different locations each night, never staying anywhere long enough to be found. They scavenged for food in restaurant dumpsters, learned which store owners might spare a piece of bread, and discovered which streets were safe and which ones held monsters. "The chocolate today," Alexander began. Luna's facade cracked slightly. "We were just looking. We know, we can't have things like that. When did you last eat?" The silence that followed told Alexander everything he needed to know. "We had jackets," Luna continued, her voice getting smaller, "but we sold them yesterday to buy food. Some bigger kids took our money while we were sleeping and said little kids don't deserve to have anything." Alexander felt rage building in his chest, not at these children, but at a world that could allow such innocence to suffer while people like him accumulated wealth they'd never spend. "You've been protecting your sister this whole time," Alexander observed. "That's what big sisters do," Luna said matter-of-factly. "Mama told me to always take care of Stella. She said sisters have to stick together no matter what." The simple wisdom of a child who'd been forced to grow up overnight nearly broke Alexander's composure completely. These weren't just homeless children, they were warriors, survivors who'd faced horrors that would crush most adults, and somehow found the courage to keep fighting for each other. But their fight was about to take a turn that none of them could have predicted. What happens when the most powerful man in the city decides that two little girls matter more than his carefully constructed life? You're both coming with me, Alexander said, his voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. We told you. We don't go with strangers, Luna repeated. But her resolve was weakening. Stella had begun shivering uncontrollably, and the night was getting colder by the minute. My name is Alexander Blackstone. I run a large company, and I have a warm house with food and clean beds. You can stay as long as you need to. What do you want from us? Luna asked, her voice filled with suspicion that no 5-year-old should ever have to possess. The question caught Alexander completely off guard. What did he want? He'd built his entire adult life around wanting nothing from anyone, depending on no one, caring for no one. But looking at these two fragile lives huddled in the cold, he realized he wanted something he'd never wanted before. To make them safe. I want to make sure you're never cold or hungry again, he said simply. It took another hour of patient conversation before Luna finally agreed. When Alexander's driver arrived and they climbed into the Bentley, both girls stared wide-eyed at their reflections in the polished interior. They'd never been in a car this expensive, never experienced this level of comfort. The elevator ride to Alexander's penthouse was equally overwhelming. When the doors opened to reveal his sprawling apartment, both girls gasped audibly. This is where you live? Stella whispered. The penthouse was a monument to Alexander's success. Modern art worth millions. Designer furniture arranged with mathematical precision. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city that had nearly killed these children. But it was also cold, sterile, completely devoid of any warmth or personality. Are you hungry? Alexander asked, and both girls nodded eagerly. He led them to his kitchen, then realized with embarrassment that his refrigerator contained little more than expensive wine and leftover takeout containers. He'd never cooked a meal in his life, never needed to think about feeding anyone but himself. He ordered pizza delivery, knowing children typically loved it, and while they waited, he showed them to one of the guest rooms. When Luna and Stella saw the enormous bed with its pristine white linens, they approached it like it was sacred.
We can really sleep here? Luna asked. It's yours for as long as you need it, Alexander assured her. When the pizza arrived, Alexander watched in amazement as the girls ate with delicate, careful bites. Despite their obvious hunger, they maintained perfect table manners, evidence of the loving mother they'd lost and the home that had been torn away from them. Tomorrow we'll get you new clothes and see a doctor, Alexander said as they finished eating. Are you going to send us away after that? Luna asked, her eyes guarded and ready for disappointment. The question pierced Alexander's heart like a spear. No, Luna. You're safe here. Both of you are safe here. That night, Alexander stood in his living room staring out at the city lights, his mind reeling from the day's events. In the span of a few hours, his carefully ordered world had been completely destroyed by two small girls who'd been staring at chocolate through a window, but the destruction was just beginning. The first few weeks with Luna and Stella transformed Alexander's sterile penthouse into something he'd never experienced before, a home filled with children's laughter, colorful toys scattered across marble floors, and the beautiful chaos that comes with caring for two energetic 5-year-olds. Alexander hired Mrs. Rodriguez, a warm grandmother figure who helped the girls adjust to their new reality. He bought them everything they could possibly need, clothes, toys, books. But noticed something troubling. Both girls remained hesitant to ask for anything, as if they were afraid their good fortune might disappear at any moment. The chocolate incident became a daily reminder of their journey. Alexander filled an entire display case with chocolate bars and placed it in the kitchen, telling the girls they could have as many as they wanted. But every morning, Luna and Stella would stand before that display and carefully select just one piece each, never taking more, despite Alexander's encouragement. Why don't you take more? Alexander asked Luna one morning. Because then there won't be enough for tomorrow, she replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who'd learned scarcity too young. And we have to make sure Stella gets hers too. Those words broke something inside Alexander's chest that he didn't even know existed. As the girls settled into their new life, Alexander found himself changing in ways that shocked everyone who knew him. He left work early to have dinner with them. He read bedtime stories, something he never imagined himself doing. He learned that Stella loved creating elaborate drawings, while Luna preferred building complex structures with blocks. His employees noticed the change immediately. The man who used to work 16-hour days now protected his evenings fiercely. Board meetings that once ran until midnight were efficiently concluded by 5 o'clock. Alexander Blackstone, the most feared CEO in corporate America, had discovered something more important than profit margins. But happiness in Alexander's life had always come with a price. During a routine pediatric visit that Alexander had scheduled to ensure both girls were healthy, Dr. Patricia Mills made a discovery that would change everything. "Mr. Blackstone, I need to speak with you privately." Dr. Mills said after examining Stella, her expression grave with concern. Alexander's blood turned to ice. "Is something wrong with Stella?" In her office, Dr. Mills pulled up Stella's chest x-rays on her computer screen. Stella has an enlarged heart, a condition called cardiomyopathy. Based on what you've told me about her mother's sudden death, it's likely the same congenital condition that killed Isabella. The words hit Alexander like a physical assault. What does that mean? It means Stella's heart is working much harder than it should to pump blood through her body. Without treatment, this condition could be fatal. However, with proper medication and potentially surgery, she can live a completely normal, healthy life. Surgery? Alexander's voice barely functioned. She'll need a specialist consultation. The surgery is complex and expensive, but she's young and otherwise healthy. With proper treatment, the prognosis is excellent. Alexander stared at the X-ray image of Stella's small heart, enlarged and struggling with every beat. "Whatever it costs, whatever she needs, make it happen immediately." "Mr. Blackstone," Dr. Mills said gently, "I have to ask, what is your legal relationship to these children? For medical decisions this significant, we need proper guardianship documentation." The question Alexander had been avoiding for weeks finally caught up with him. Legally, he had no right to make medical decisions for Luna or Stella. He was essentially a stranger who'd taken in 2 homeless children without any official authority. The man who controlled billion-dollar corporations suddenly realized he had no legal control over the 2 people who mattered most to him in the world. And that was about to become a much bigger problem than anyone could have anticipated. The X-ray images glowed on Dr. Mills' computer screen like a death sentence. Stella's tiny heart, enlarged and struggling, seemed to pulse with Alexander's own panic. Cardiomyopathy. The same condition that had stolen their mother. "How long does she have?" Alexander's voice cracked like breaking glass. "Without treatment? 6 months, maybe less. With surgery? She could live a completely normal life." Alexander stared at the medical scans, his fortune suddenly meaningless against this diagnosis. All his billions couldn't buy back time if they'd discovered this too late. But here's where the story takes a devastating turn. "Mr. Blackstone," Dr. Mills continued, her voice heavy with legal reality, "I need to ask about your guardianship status. For major medical decisions, we require proper documentation." The words hit Alexander like ice water. He had no legal rights, none. He was essentially a stranger who'd taken in 2 homeless children. That night, Alexander sat Luna and Stella down in his living room. The city lights twinkled beyond the windows, but darkness seemed to close in around them. "Stella needs special medicine for her heart," he began carefully. "Am I going to die like Mama?" Stella's innocent question shattered the room's silence. "No, sweetheart. The doctors can fix your heart. But..." Alexander hesitated, knowing his next words would change everything. "I need to become your legal father to make sure I can always take care of you." Luna's eyes narrowed with the wisdom of a child who'd learned not to trust promises. "What does that mean?" It means I want to adopt you both, make you my daughters forever. The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Stella, with her 5-year-old directness, asked the question that stopped Alexander's heart. Does this mean you want to be our daddy? Alexander had built empires, crushed competitors, commanded boardrooms filled with powerful men, but this moment terrified him more than any hostile takeover. Would you like me to be your daddy? Luna studied his face with those old, wise eyes. If you're our daddy, you can't ever leave us or give us away. Promise? I promise. Forever. Did you catch what just happened? This billionaire CEO just made the most important deal of his life, but the legal system has other plans. The adoption paperwork sat on Alexander's desk like a mountain of hope and terror. Social workers would investigate, home visits would be conducted, background checks would take months. Meanwhile, Stella's condition couldn't wait for bureaucracy. Dr. Pierce, the world's leading pediatric cardiac surgeon, agreed to perform the operation. The surgery would take 8 hours. 8 hours of Alexander's new world hanging in the balance. The night before surgery, Alexander held Stella's small hand in the hospital bed. Are you scared, Daddy? She whispered. The title still felt foreign on his tongue, but it filled his chest with warmth he'd never known. A little, he admitted. But you're the bravest girl I know. Will you stay with me every second? What Alexander didn't know was that while he was fighting to save Stella's life, someone else was preparing to destroy his newfound family forever. The surgery had been a miracle, 8 hours of agony followed by Dr. Pierce's triumphant smile. Stella's heart was fixed, her future secured. Alexander had never felt such relief, such pure joy. For 3 blissful weeks, they lived like a normal family. Stella recovered with the resilience of childhood. Luna stopped looking over her shoulder for danger that might never come. Alexander discovered the simple pleasure of bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. And then the phone rang. Mr. Blackstone, this is Detective Rodriguez with Child Protective Services. We need to speak with you immediately about Luna and Stella Morrison. The name Morrison hit Alexander like a physical blow. What about them? We've received information suggesting these children have living relatives. You need to bring them to our office tomorrow morning. Alexander's hands shook as he hung up. Morrison. The girls had never mentioned that name. Their mother was Isabella Delacroix. Their father... They'd never spoken of their father. The next morning, Alexander sat in a sterile government office with Luna and Stella clinging to his sides. Across from them, a stern woman named Miss Hawkins shuffled through official documents. Mr. Blackstone, we've been contacted by Robert Morrison, who claims to be these children's paternal grandfather. The world tilted. Alexander felt his carefully rebuilt life cracking at the foundations. That's impossible. They have no family. They told me. Children often don't know about extended family members, especially when there's been estrangement. Miss Hawkins' voice was clinical, cold. Mr. Morrison says he's been searching for his granddaughters since learning of his daughter-in-law's death. Luna spoke up, her voice small but defiant. We don't have a grandfather. We only have Daddy Alexander. But here's the truth that's about to destroy everything they've built. Miss Hawkins pulled out a thick file. Your father was Marcus Morrison. He died in a car accident when you were 2 years old. There was apparently a family dispute that severed contact between the paternal and maternal sides of your family. Alexander watched Luna and Stella's faces crumble with confusion. Their entire origin story was incomplete, missing crucial pieces that could now tear them away from him. What does this mean? Alexander demanded. It means we must investigate Mr. Morrison's claim. If he is their biological grandfather and deemed fit to care for them, family reunification takes priority. The system that had failed these children when they needed it most was now threatening to destroy the family that had saved them. 3 days later, Alexander met Robert Morrison for the first time. The man was in his 70s with kind eyes and weathered hands that spoke of honest work. He looked nothing like the villain Alexander had conjured in his imagination. Mr. Blackstone, Robert said quietly, I want to thank you for saving my granddaughters' lives. When I think of what they endured while I was searching. You were searching? Alexander's voice was sharp with skepticism. Robert's eyes filled with tears. I lost my son Marcus in a car accident 5 years ago. He'd married Isabella against my wishes. I thought she was too young, not right for him. We fought. Terrible words were said. Marcus cut off contact completely. The old man's voice broke. I was too proud to reach out, too stubborn. Then I learned Marcus was dead and Isabella had moved, changed her name back to Delacroix. I've been hiring private investigators for 3 years, trying to find my granddaughters. Alexander stared at this man who represented his worst nightmare and greatest fear. Robert Morrison wasn't a monster. He was a grandfather who'd lost everything and was desperate to reclaim the only family he had left. I know you love them, Robert continued. I can see it in your eyes. But they're all I have left of my son. Surely you can understand that. What happens next will determine whether love is stronger than blood, whether chosen family can survive the law's cold reality. The custody battle was about to begin, and Alexander had no idea if his billions could buy him the only thing that truly mattered, his daughters. The family courthouse looked like a temple of justice, but to Alexander, it felt like a funeral home, where his dreams would be buried. 3 months of legal preparation had led to this moment. 3 months of watching Luna and Stella grow more anxious, more clingy, sensing the adult storm gathering around them. Alexander's legal team occupied one side of the courtroom, 5 of Manhattan's most expensive family lawyers, armed with precedents and legal strategies. On the other side sat Robert Morrison with a single court-appointed attorney, looking small and overwhelmed but determined. Judge Martha Hendricks entered, her black robes rustling like raven wings. Alexander had researched her extensively, 20 years on the family court bench, known for prioritizing children's welfare over technicalities. His only hope. This case presents a complex situation, Judge Hendricks began. We have 2 parties who both clearly love these children, but only one can have primary custody. Robert Morrison took the stand first. His testimony was devastating in its honesty. I failed my son, he said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Pride and stubbornness cost me 5 years with Marcus before he died. I won't make that mistake with Luna and Stella. They're my flesh and blood, my second chance to do right by my family. But here's what made Alexander's blood run cold. I have a house with a yard in a safe neighborhood. I'm retired, so I can give them my full attention. I have their father's photo albums, his childhood toys, stories about who Marcus was. These girls deserve to know where they came from. Alexander's lawyer, James Mitchell, presented their case with surgical precision. The months of care, the life-saving surgery Alexander had funded, the emotional bonds that had formed. Mr. Blackstone has provided these children with stability, medical care, and most importantly, love during their most vulnerable period. To disrupt this now would cause irreparable psychological harm. Then came the moment that would haunt Alexander forever. Judge Hendricks called for a recess to interview Luna and Stella privately. Alexander watched his daughters disappear into the judge's chambers, knowing their words would determine his fate. During the break, Alexander found himself alone with Robert Morrison in the courthouse hallway. The silence stretched between them like a battlefield. Mr. Blackstone, Robert said quietly, I want you to know I'm grateful for everything you've done. You saved their lives when I couldn't even find them. Alexander studied the older man's face, seeing genuine anguish there. They saved my life too. I can see how much you love them, and I can see how much they love you. Robert's voice broke. Maybe there's a way we can both be part of their lives. Before Alexander could respond, they were summoned back to the courtroom. Judge Hendricks returned with an expression that revealed nothing. I've spoken extensively with Luna and Stella. This is perhaps the most difficult custody decision I've ever faced. Alexander's heart stopped beating. Both parties love these children deeply. Both have legitimate claims to their care. However, I must consider what serves the children's best interests above all else. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. I'm awarding joint custody. Mr. Morrison will serve as primary guardian, with Mr. Blackstone maintaining significant visitation rights, including holidays and summers. The gavel fell like a gunshot. Alexander had won and lost simultaneously. He would see his daughters, but they wouldn't be his anymore. Not really. The family he'd built was being legally dismantled in the name of blood ties and traditional family structures. Outside the courthouse, Luna and Stella clung to both men, confused by the legal complexities, but understanding that their world was about to change again. The battle was over. Now came the harder part, learning to share the love of his life. The judge's decision felt like being cut in half. Joint custody meant everyone won and everyone lost simultaneously. Alexander would have his daughters for summers, holidays, and alternate weekends. Robert would have them for the daily moments, school mornings, scraped knees, bedtime stories. It was a solution that satisfied the law but broke both men's hearts. The transition meeting took place in a neutral conference room, sterile and cold. Luna and Stella sat between the two men who would now share their lives, their small faces etched with confusion. "What does this mean?" Luna asked, her 5-year-old mind struggling with adult complexities. "It means you get 2 homes," Alexander explained, his voice carefully steady. "Grandpa Robert's house will be your main home, but you'll also spend lots of time with me in the city." Stella's eyes filled with tears. "But we want to stay with you, Daddy." The word daddy hung in the air like an accusation. Robert flinched, perhaps realizing that while he had biology on his side, Alexander had claimed their hearts during their most vulnerable months. Here's what nobody anticipated about this arrangement. The first weekend visit was torture. Alexander picked up Luna and Stella from Robert's modest house 3 hours north of Manhattan. The girls were quiet during the drive, processing their new reality. Their old room in his penthouse remained exactly as they'd left it. But something had fundamentally changed. They were no longer his children living in his home, they were visitors. "Do you like living with Grandpa Robert?" Alexander asked carefully during dinner. Luna, ever the diplomat, nodded. "He tells us stories about our daddy Marcus. He looked just like me, except he was a boy." Stella was less diplomatic. "But we miss you every day. Grandpa Robert gets sad when he thinks we're not looking." The truth was devastating for everyone involved. Robert Morrison was a good man trying to do right by his granddaughters, but he was also a lonely widower who'd lost his son and desperately needed these children to fill the void. Alexander was a man who discovered love for the first time and couldn't bear to lose it. The girls were caught between 2 forms of love, biological obligation and chosen family. Sunday night partings became exercises in controlled heartbreak. Alexander would drive the girls back to Robert's house, help them carry their weekend bags to the porch, and watch them disappear behind a door that closed him out of their daily lives. "This isn't working," Alexander told his lawyer after 6 weeks of joint custody hell. "The girls are miserable. Robert's miserable." "The arrangement is legal and fair," James Mitchell replied, "unless there's evidence of abuse or neglect." "There's no abuse. Robert loves them. That's what makes this so impossible." But sometimes the most broken situations create unexpected solutions. It was Stella who forced the issue during a phone call on a Tuesday evening. "Dowdy Alexander," she said, her small voice carrying clearly through the speaker, "can you come live near us? Grandpa Robert gets lonely when we're with you, and we miss you when we're here." Out of the mouths of babes came the idea that would change everything. What if Alexander didn't try to take the girls away from their grandfather? What if he joined them instead? His billionaire CEO, who'd never compromised on anything, was about to make the biggest compromise of his life. And the decision to relocate his entire life felt both insane and inevitable. Alexander Blackstone, master of Manhattan's financial district, was about to become a small town resident for the sake of 2 5-year-old girls who'd stolen his heart. Robert Morrison's house sat on Maple Street in Millbrook, New York, population 8,000. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest scandal was usually who was dating whom. and where a billionaire CEO moving in would cause months of gossip. Alexander found a house 3 blocks away. Not the mansion his wealth could have purchased, but a reasonable 4-bedroom colonial that wouldn't scream outsider to the locals. Close enough that Luna and Stella could walk between both homes, far enough to give Robert his space as primary guardian. The challenges started immediately. "You're really going to work from here?" Robert asked skeptically as Alexander's moving trucks arrived. "Technology makes it possible. I'll still need to be in Manhattan 3 days a week, but I can run most operations remotely." What Alexander didn't mention was the board meeting where his executives had questioned his sanity. "You're moving to a small town for 2 children who aren't even legally yours?" his CFO had asked incredulously. The answer was simple: yes, absolutely yes. But small town life proved more complicated than Manhattan boardrooms. Alexander's first trip to the local grocery store created a sensation. Whispers followed him down every aisle. "That's the billionaire who moved here for the Morrison girls. I heard he paid for the little one's heart surgery. Seems decent enough, but why would someone that rich want to live here?" Luna and Stella adjusted to their new routine with the resilience of children. Mornings with Grandpa Robert, who made pancakes shaped like animals and told stories about their father. Afternoons often with Alexander, who helped with homework and attended every school play, soccer game, and parent-teacher conference alongside Robert. The arrangement was awkward at first. 2 men sharing parental duties, neither quite sure of their boundaries. "She needs her math homework checked," Robert would say, handing Stella's backpack to Alexander. "You're better at bedtime stories," Alexander would reply, stepping back when the girls needed comfort after nightmares. And then something unexpected began to happen. The competition between them gradually transformed into cooperation. They started consulting each other about discipline decisions. Robert taught Alexander small-town customs. Alexander helped Robert with technology and medical appointments. Most importantly, they both put Luna and Stella's needs above their own egos. "You know," Robert said one evening as they watched the girls play in his backyard, "Marcus would have liked you. He always said the measure of a man wasn't what he owned, but what he was willing to sacrifice for love." Alexander looked at the man who'd become an unlikely partner in parenting. "I think I would have liked Marcus too." The hardest part wasn't adjusting to small-town life. It was learning that love doesn't divide when shared, it multiplies. But their unconventional family was about to face its biggest test yet. The sterile hospital corridor felt different this time. 6 months had passed since Alexander first walked these halls, desperate to save a little girl's life. Now, as he sat beside Robert in the cardiac unit waiting room, the weight of shared parenthood pressed down on both men like a physical force. Stella had been complaining of chest pains for 3 days, the same symptoms that had nearly killed her mother, the same condition that had required life-saving surgery just 18 months earlier. Both men knew the statistics. Pediatric heart patients required lifelong monitoring, and complications could emerge without warning. "She seemed fine yesterday," Robert whispered, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. "We were building that dollhouse together, and she was laughing, running around the yard like any normal 6-year-old. Alexander stared at the closed examination room door. Heart conditions don't announce themselves. They strike when you least expect it. His voice carried the hollow tone of a man who'd learned to expect the worst from life, even when surrounded by love. Dr. Pierce emerged from the examination room, his expression unreadable. Both men rose simultaneously, their previous custody battles forgotten in the face of shared terror for the child they both adored. "Gentlemen," Dr. Pierce began, removing his stethoscope, "I have news." The silence stretched between them like a blade. Alexander felt his carefully rebuilt world threatening to collapse again. He'd lost everything once before. His parents in a car accident when he was 12, his faith in love, his ability to trust happiness. The thought of losing Stella felt like facing death itself. The chest pains were caused by muscle strain from playground activities. Her heart is functioning perfectly. Better than perfectly, actually. Dr. Pierce smiled for the first time since entering the waiting area. The surgery was more successful than we dared hope. Her cardiac function is now completely normal. She'll need annual checkups, but medically speaking, she's cured. Robert dropped back into his chair, tears streaming down his face. Alexander remained standing, his body refusing to believe what his ears had heard. You're certain? Alexander's CEO instincts demanded confirmation of every detail. I've reviewed her EKG, echocardiogram, and stress test results. Stella's heart is stronger now than most children her age. The chest pains were growing pains, literally. She's been so active lately that her intercostal muscles are developing rapidly. The relief hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd prepared himself for devastating news, for another fight against impossible odds, for the possibility of losing the child who'd taught him how to love. Instead, he was receiving confirmation that their greatest fear had been conquered. But as they drove home together, Robert, Alexander, Luna, and Stella packed into Robert's old sedan. Luna made an observation that would change everything once again. Daddy, Alexander looks sad even though Stella's okay, she announced from the back seat. I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm relieved, Alexander replied, catching her eyes in the rearview mirror. Then why do you keep looking like you're going to cry? And why do you always look sad when we have to say goodbye on Sundays? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Robert glanced at Alexander, recognizing something in his expression that demanded attention. Have you ever realized that sometimes the cure for one problem reveals an even bigger problem you didn't know existed? What Luna observed would force Alexander to confront a truth that could either destroy their family or transform it forever. That evening, after Stella had been tucked into bed with extra kisses and reassurances, Alexander found himself standing in Robert's kitchen, staring out at the tire swing hanging motionless in the backyard. The same swing where he'd pushed both girls countless times, their laughter echoing across the small yard like music he'd never heard in his Manhattan penthouse. She's right, Robert said quietly, pouring 2 cups of coffee. Luna, she sees things adults try to hide from children. Accepted the coffee but didn't drink it. I hate leaving them every Sunday night. I hate that I only get weekends and holidays. I hate that I'm missing the daily moments, helping with homework, bedtime stories, the random conversations that happen at breakfast. You could always move closer, Robert suggested carefully. There are several houses for sale on Maple Street. You'd be 10 minutes away instead of 3 hours. It's not that simple. Blackstone Industries requires... Alexander stopped mid-sentence, realizing how hollow his excuse sounded. For 18 months, he'd been telling himself that his business empire demanded his physical presence in Manhattan. But the truth was more complicated. What if I told you I've been running the company more effectively from here than I ever did from the 42nd floor? Alexander admitted. What if I told you that the 3 days I spend in the city feel like prison compared to the 4 days I spend here? Robert studied Alexander's face in the dim kitchen light. Then I'd ask why you haven't made the obvious choice. The answer came from a place Alexander rarely accessed, the vulnerable core he'd buried under years of corporate armor. Because I'm terrified of disrupting what we've built. This arrangement works. The girls are happy. You're a wonderful grandfather, and I get to be part of their lives. What if I change too much and everything falls apart? Or, Robert countered, what if you're so afraid of losing what you have that you're missing the chance to have everything you actually want? Before Alexander could respond, Luna appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair tousled from sleep. I had a bad dream, she announced, climbing into Alexander's lap without invitation. What kind of a bad dream, sweetheart? I dreamed that you had to go back to the city and couldn't come back anymore, and Stella got sick again, but you weren't here to help her. Luna buried her face against Alexander's chest. I don't like it when our family gets separated. Alexander felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking but expanding. Luna, what if I didn't have to go back to the city as much? What if I could live here, close to you and Stella and Grandpa Robert? Luna lifted her head, eyes wide with possibility. Could you really do that? I think I could, but it would mean big changes. I'd have to sell my apartment in the city, buy a house here, change how I work. Would you be happier? Luna asked, with the directness only children possess. The question struck Alexander silent. When had he last considered his own happiness as a valid factor in major life decisions? For most of his adult life, happiness had seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness that would compromise his success. Yes, he said finally. I think I would be much happier. Then you should do it, Luna declared with absolute certainty. Grown-ups always tell kids that being happy is important. Why don't grown-ups listen to their own advice? Robert chuckled from across the kitchen. Out of the mouths of babes. Alexander looked around the modest kitchen, nothing like his sleek Manhattan penthouse, but filled with warmth, family photos, and the comfortable chaos of real life. For the first time in his adult life, he was contemplating a decision based not on profit margins or strategic advantage, but on love. What happens when a billionaire realizes that everything he thought he wanted was just keeping him from what he actually needed? Alexander's next choice would either be the biggest mistake of his career or the smartest decision of his life. 3 months later, Alexander stood in the doorway of his new home office, watching Luna and Stella play in the backyard through his window. The house on Maple Street was a far cry from his Manhattan penthouse. Colonial style, white picket fence, neighbors who waved from their porches and knew everyone's business. Everything he'd once considered beneath his sophisticated urban lifestyle had become the foundation of his happiness. The transition hadn't been seamless. Blackstone Industries' board of directors had initially panicked when their CEO announced his relocation plans. Stock prices fluctuated wildly for 2 weeks as investors questioned Alexander's commitment to the company he'd built from nothing. But something remarkable had happened during those uncertain weeks. Alexander's leadership became more strategic, more thoughtful. Without the constant pressure of back-to-back Manhattan meetings, he found himself making better decisions, seeing long-term patterns he'd missed while caught up in daily corporate drama. The quarterly profits are up 12%, his assistant reported during their daily video conference. The distributed leadership model is actually improving efficiency across all departments. Alexander smiled, remembering how he'd once believed that physical presence equaled professional effectiveness. Now he spent mornings reviewing international markets from his home office, afternoons helping with homework and attending school plays, and evenings having family dinners that had become the highlight of his day. The small town had initially received him with polite skepticism. Billionaire CEOs didn't typically relocate to communities where the biggest excitement was Friday night high school football games. But Alexander's genuine love for Luna and Stella, combined with his respectful approach to local customs, gradually won over even the most doubtful residents. You know, Alexander, Robert said one evening as they watched the girls practice their school presentation in the living room, I never expected to gain a son when I fought for custody of my granddaughters. The comment caught Alexander off guard. In all his calculations about joint custody arrangements and visitation schedules, he'd never considered that Robert might become more than just a co-parent. Somewhere along the way, they'd evolved from legal adversaries to genuine friends, united by their shared commitment to raising 2 extraordinary little girls. I never expected to find a father either, Alexander replied quietly. I lost my parents when I was 12. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone who cared about my well-being just because I existed, not because of what I could provide. Their conversation was interrupted by Stella running over with a drawing she'd completed for art class. Look, I drew our whole family. The picture showed 4 figures standing in front of 2 houses. Herself, Luna, Grandpa Robert, and Daddy Alexander. Above them, she'd drawn a heart that encompassed all 4 figures and both houses. We're all connected, Stella explained proudly, even when we're in different places. Alexander studied the drawing, marveling at how a 6-year-old had captured something he'd struggled to understand as an adult. Love didn't require proximity to exist. It didn't diminish when shared among multiple people. Instead, it grew stronger, creating connections that transcended physical space and legal documents. Sometimes the most profound truths come from the smallest voices. But just when Alexander thought he understood what family meant, Luna would ask a question that revealed there was still one more lesson to learn. 2 years after that rain-soaked night, when Alexander first spotted two small faces pressed against a store window, he found himself standing in exactly the same spot with Luna and Stella. The corner store had been transformed into a cozy cafe, but the large front window remained unchanged, a portal between the warmth inside and the uncertainty of the street. "Do you remember this place?" Alexander asked, holding both girls' hands as they stood on the sidewalk where their story had begun. "This is where we used to look at the chocolate," Luna said matter-of-factly. At 7 years old, she possessed a remarkable ability to discuss their difficult past without being consumed by it. "We were really hungry back then. This is where you first saw us," Stella added, squeezing Alexander's hand. "Grandpa Robert says that was the most important day in our whole family's history." Alexander knelt down to their eye level, studying their faces in the afternoon sunlight. Gone were the hollow cheeks and frightened eyes he'd first encountered. These were healthy, confident children who'd learned to trust that tomorrow would bring safety and love. "Can I tell you both a secret?" Alexander asked. Both girls nodded eagerly, always ready for grown-up confidences. "I used to think that this was the place where I found you, but I was wrong. This is actually the place where you found me." Luna tilted her head with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Alexander thought carefully about how to explain a truth that had taken him years to understand. "Before I met you two, I had lots of money and a big company and a fancy apartment. But I didn't have the most important thing of all." "What's that?" Stella whispered. "I didn't have love. I didn't know how to be happy. I thought being successful meant never needing anyone else, never caring too much about anything. But when I saw you both standing here, looking through this window, something changed inside my heart." "Like magic?" Luna asked. "Exactly like magic. You taught me that the best parts of life aren't things you can buy or sell. They're the people you choose to love and who choose to love you back." They walked into the cafe, where Robert was already waiting at their usual table by the window. This had become their monthly tradition, returning to the place where their unconventional family had first connected, sharing hot chocolate and stories while watching the world pass by outside. "You know what I realized?" Alexander said as they settled into their seats. "I spent 34 years building a business empire, thinking that success meant having more than everyone else. But the real success was learning that happiness comes from giving everything away, your time, your heart, your whole life, to the people who matter most." "So we made you rich in a different way?" Stella asked with 7-year-old wisdom. "You made me the richest man in the world," Alexander confirmed. "Not because of my bank account, but because I have you and Luna and Grandpa Robert. I have a family that chose each other instead of just being stuck with each other." Luna suddenly pressed her face against the cafe window, just as she had years earlier when staring at chocolate she couldn't afford. But this time she was looking at something different. "Daddy Alexander," she said quietly, "there's a little boy out there who looks really sad and hungry. Can we help him too?" Alexander followed her gaze and saw a child, maybe 8 years old, standing alone in the drizzle. The boy's clothes were too thin for the weather, and he clutched a torn backpack against his chest. Some stories end where they began, but the best stories never really end. They just become the beginning of someone else's story. What Alexander did next would prove that the greatest gift of being rescued is learning how to rescue others. Without hesitation, Alexander stood up from their table and walked outside into the light rain. Luna and Stella pressed their faces against the cafe window. watching as their father approached the lone child standing on the sidewalk. "Hey there," Alexander said gently, kneeling down to the boy's level. "Are you okay?" The child looked up with eyes that Alexander recognized immediately, the same mixture of fear, hunger, and desperate hope he'd seen in Luna and Stella's faces 2 years earlier. The boy couldn't have been more than 8, but his expression carried the weight of someone much older. "I'm fine, mister," the boy said automatically, the practiced response of a child who'd learned that admitting need could sometimes lead to worse situations. "What's your name?" "Marcus," the boy whispered, and Alexander felt his breath catch. The same name as Luna and Stella's father, the son Robert had lost too young. "Marcus, when did you last eat something?" The question hung in the air, just as it had years earlier, when Alexander had asked Luna the same thing. Marcus's silence provided the same heartbreaking answer. Inside the cafe, Robert had joined Luna and Stella at the window. All three watched as Alexander extended his hand to Marcus, offering the same choice he'd once offered to 2 frightened little girls. "There's a warm cafe right here with food and hot chocolate. Would you like to come inside and get warm?" Marcus hesitated, looking around the empty street as if checking for dangers Alexander couldn't see. "Are you going to call the police or the social workers?" "I'm going to make sure you're safe and fed," Alexander replied honestly. "And then we'll figure out how to help you find where you belong." Something in Alexander's tone must have convinced Marcus, because the boy slowly reached out and took his hand. Together they walked into the cafe, where Robert immediately stood up to make room at their table. "Everyone," Alexander said as they approached, "I'd like you to meet Marcus. Marcus, this is my family, Luna, Stella, and their grandpa Robert." Luna immediately scooted over to make room for Marcus on the bench beside her. "Are you hungry? They have really good grilled cheese here, and the hot chocolate is the best in the whole world." As Marcus tentatively joined their table, Alexander caught Robert's eye across the booth. The older man nodded almost imperceptibly, a silent communication between 2 men who understood that their family was about to expand again. Over the next hour, Marcus's story emerged in fragments. His grandmother had died 3 weeks earlier, leaving him alone in a city where he knew no one. He'd been sleeping in doorways, scavenging for food, trying to avoid the attention of adults who might separate him from the few possessions he had left. "Marcus," Alexander said carefully, "how would you feel about staying with us tonight? We have a warm house with extra bedrooms, and tomorrow we can start figuring out a more permanent solution." The boy looked around the table at these strangers who'd welcomed him without question, offered him food without expecting anything in return, and treated him like family from the moment he'd walked through the door. "You'd really do that for me?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "Of course we would," Stella said with absolute certainty. "That's what families do. They help each other." As they prepared to leave the cafe, Luna tugged on Alexander's sleeve. "Daddy, is this how you felt when you first helped us?" Alexander considered the question seriously. "You know what, Luna? This feels even better, because now I understand something I didn't know back then." "What's that?" "I thought I was just helping 2 little girls who needed food and shelter, but what I was really doing was learning how to be part of something bigger than myself. Now, when we help Marcus, we're not just giving him what he needs, we're showing him how to help the next person who needs it." 6 months later, Alexander stood in the same cafe window, but this time he wasn't looking out at the street. He was looking at a wall covered with photographs. Dozens of children who had found homes, families who had been reunited, and success stories that had grown from a simple foundation, the Blackstone Family Fund, dedicated to ensuring no child would ever have to stand outside, looking in when they could be inside, safe and loved. Marcus, now officially adopted by Alexander and living full-time in the house on Maple Street, had become Luna and Stella's protective older brother. Robert had embraced his role as grandfather to 3 children instead of 2, and Alexander had discovered that the most successful business he'd ever built wasn't Blackstone Industries, It was this unconventional family that kept growing every time love demanded more space. The cold CEO who once believed emotions were weakness had learned the most powerful truth of all. The greatest fortune isn't what you accumulate for yourself, but what you give away to others. And sometimes the most important business deals aren't negotiated in boardrooms. They're sealed with trust between a hungry child and an adult who remembers what it feels like to be saved. The chocolate bar that started it all still sat in a frame on their mantle at home, not because they needed the reminder, but because it represented something profound. Even the smallest act of noticing someone else's need can transform not just their world, but your own. Alexander Blackstone had learned that true wealth isn't measured in quarterly profits, but in the number of lives you touch, the love you choose to share, and the family you build, one heart at a time. In the end, some stories don't just have happy endings. They become the beginning of countless other happy endings, rippling outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves of hope that reach farther than anyone could have imagined.